Right. Oh, yeah.
She started like in October. Yeah.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Same thing.
So this is his second year.
I mean,
Was
Yeah.
you don't even know how.
Hi, everybody. I am Raina Nielsen, the event specialist here at Blue Cypress Books, and I am super excited to welcome all of you here this evening in our new fancied up event space for the evening. We, of course, are here with Katy Morlas Shannon. She is the author of Antoine of Oak Alley and a historian whose work was integral in the research for Whitney Plantation. She also helped build a searchable database that of 400 enslaved people at Evergreen Plantation, and currently works as a historian at Laura Plantation. She's dedicated her career to uncovering these untold stories of enslaved people, just like the one that she documents here in Antoine of Oak Alley. She's in conversation this evening with Joe Banner, who, as a descendant of these enslaved people, has spent her career in film and in I totally like that word.
Tourism.
Yes, tourism. Thank you. To make sure that the stories that we see in film and television, and we read in books and brochures, and that we hear when we take these tours of historic places, are the whole story, the true story. Her foundation, the Descendants Project, is a nonprofit that it fights for the quality of life of these descendants of enslaved people here in our community and beyond. I am, for one, very grateful to be in this room and to have been a part of making this event happen. And I want you all to please join me in welcoming Katy and Joe to
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you all for coming here, and for those who are watching us through stream. But I'm very excited to be here with Katy and talk about Antoine. I have to say this because, Katy, you were instrumental in providing my family with research about my ancestor at Laura Plantation. And that is the most complete information I think that I have of any of my enslaved ancestors. Big Anthony at Laura Plantation. So I really respect your work, and this definitely had a lot of meaning to me. And I'm happy that not only are you giving me more information about my ancestors, but you're working towards helping other people, other descendants, connect with their ancestors as well. And especially hearing your story about Antoine. And this is a story that I didn't really know about until a few years ago. So I'm just so happy that you're shedding light on this. So what inspired you to write about Antoine?
Well, it was kind of a roundabout discovery. San Marmion, my good friend and collaborator at Laura Plantation, and I are at work on a book about the Union soldiers. So the enslaved people men who ran away from the plantations and joined the Union Army and fought for their freedom. And while I was doing that research, I came across a man. And I said, oh, this sounds familiar. I think I know his story. And then I realized that he was Antoine's son. Now, I had heard Antoine's story just very briefly, Antoine of the Pecans. And then I realized, well, he has a son in the Union Army. And then I started putting pieces together. And I realized that instead of just being like a blurb in a book, he had a full narrative that could be told and could be presented as a biography. And that's what I always am trying to do, is to tell a full, complete picture of people who were enslaved, so that they're not just this anonymous group or just a stereotype, so that people can empathize and see they had lives just like we do. And that kind of led to a series of discoveries that then led to this larger project.
Great. Well, reading your book, one of the stories, I think within the first couple of pages of the book, you talk about going to Oak Alley and having this experience that I actually had a very similar experience of going and touring this plantation and hearing. I won't even repeat the story that was told on the tour, but it was one that was very offensive, especially to a person of color. And I was there with my grandmother and my mom and my twin sister, and we heard this really kind of demeaning story. And it was really one that hurt me, So I appreciated when you kind of went through that same experience, walking through those grounds and feeling the story that just wasn't right. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So I was fascinated with Louisiana history from an early age. I think because my grandparents, particularly my father, told a lot of stories, and one of the stories that he would tell is how his family, while not anything like a valley, they have a small plantation, and he mentioned slaves, and this came up during a family trip to Mount Vernon, and so from there I wanted to know more. So I did. I started reading about plantations and Louisiana history and learning about it. And then I started making my parents take me to plantations, including my poor sisters got dragged along on these historic trips that I think they would have preferred not go on necessarily. But I arrived there and took these tours, and I was so stunned to hear the message that they were telling, which was so different from what the reality of the historical narrative was. And I would not go back to Oak Alley for after that. Really, I didn't, because they were all in costumes and they were drinking their mint juleps. And here Antoine had been enslaved, and I saw his name on that was my first intro to Antoine. They did acknowledge that there were enslaved people there on a plaque near where the slave quarters might have been. So I saw his name, and for whatever reason, it stood out to me. And I was probably like around 12 or 13 at the time. But even then, I knew that things were just not right there. But unfortunately, at that time, that was rather the norm, wouldn't you say? And
Absolutely.
And with Joe having worked in the tourism industry now, we've seen an evolution in how it's being presented. Now, there's still places that need work, sites that need to be improved, but even Oak Alley now has acknowledged the presence of the enslaved, and they've built these slave reproduction slave cabins and have an exhibit. So for that, I did acknowledge, that happened, and that's good, and that's good progress. So I've seen growth since then.
Sure. And I want to, yes, and there definitely is growth. And I want to just state by saying that we aren't here to bash plantations
No.
But I think these discussions are so important to have them, just to show you, as descendants who live along the river, we're not enemies in telling the history. We're here to actually, we want to discover, we want to add more dimension, which I think just makes it better, so that it's not our idea to like just say, oh no, just don't go there. We actually want more dimension, and we're not afraid to hear those stories that may be that are painful, right? Because It's, at least you're acknowledging that is a start. But yeah, I think that I'm seeing progress. It reminds me of a story when I worked at the tourist commission in our area. And one of the board members of the tourist commission, we were talking about like how things are changing. And this particular commissioner of the tourist commission said, oh, finally, we're in the 20th century, which sounded good. I was like, but we're in the 21st century. So, so it's kind of like you move. If this was like 20 years ago, this would be progress. But right now, you're just kind of like getting halfway to where you should be. So do you find that that's kind of frustrating?
Yes. Yes. And the other thing, if you really step back and look at Oak Alley in a historical perspective, in a more like global perspective as a historic site, in fact, Antoine's story is probably the most significant thing that happened there, because his propagation of the pecans led to the development of this whole commercial industry that is now makes millions every year. So really, if you think about it, that was probably the most significant thing that happened on that site. And yet it's not what we hear about. Even still, it's not the predominant message that's being sent out there. Now, granted, the oaks are beautiful, and I mean, I think that that they'll always be beautiful, but there's brutality and there's beauty interwoven in that site.
Right. And that's the story of plantations, is that you have beautiful places and beautiful landscapes and talented botanists and horticulturists who were enslaved, who made these creations and other tasks on the plantation. So you got this beauty, but you also have the brutality of it as well, and trying to figure out that dynamic.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's what's always, it's so much more complicated than people want to think about, in terms of there's some sites that we don't want to talk about the big house at all. We don't want to go in the big house. We don't want to focus on that. And I understand where they're coming from with that, but think about who built the big house. Okay. So it's actually showing off the skills of these enslaved laborers. And it's remarkable that they're still standing, and it's a testament to their skill and their talent and their artistry. But then, you have people who only want to focus on that. So what I love is the intersection between the stories, between Black and white, between slave and free, and how people's lives were intertwined at that time. And it was very much an integrated landscape, not equal by any means, but they lived amongst each other in a way that I think we don't so much even now. So that complexity. And I think that's what I try to touch on in Antoine was I didn't shy away from talking about the people who enslaved him, because their story is crucial to the narrative as well. And that helps you understand the context. You can't tell one and not tell the other, because you're losing the context of the experience, if that makes sense.
No, it totally makes sense. And what I like about your book is you also focus a lot on Zephyr, and you paid a lot of attention to the connection between. It could have almost been Zephyr's book too, because you really fleshed that out, talking about their bond. But what I loved about the book is you, I think, paid attention. Instead of, you really gave them titles. Not that they needed titles, but that you really gave them, like, for example, you said that Zephyr was basically a chemist working with the sugar and all the different tasks that he had. And you acknowledge that these roles that, you're an architect, you are a chemist, you're a botanist. Right. And I think it's so important to name them specific to their talent versus just saying, oh, well, he just planted trees, or so.
A slave.
Right.
Just
right.
This very ambiguous, just slave. No, they were so much more than that, and they had these amazing skills and talents. And so, I mean, I think of Antoine almost as an artist too.
Right.
I think about the garden was his palette. But yeah, Zephyr. So Zephyr is or was. I get present and past mixed up because they're so real to me, and I hang with them every day. But Zephyr was Antoine's father, and he had the most important job on the plantation, that of the sugar maker. And he was in charge of making sure that the sugar granulated properly. And the whole enterprise rested on him knowing the exact moment for granulation and the crystallization. And it was a high pressure job, high stakes. Now, he was rewarded for it, and he received recognition for it. And in some ways, his family benefited from it. He was ultimately freed. But it came with risk, because high risk, high reward. And so one of my arguments in the book is that Antoine was able to become who he was and take on that leadership role and have that kind of visionary idea of himself because of who his father was. And that was that. So Zephyr, I encountered Zephyr when I was about 21 or 22 in the Tulane archives.
Don't you love the name Zephyr, first of all? I think that's a pretty cool name.
But yeah, I was going through papers, and I looked at it and I said, I should save this. This is this. It was him, one quick brief interview of a son of a plantation owner talking to him about his life and his memories. And I said, this has nothing to do with what I'm working on right now, but let me set it aside and save it. I completely forgot about it till I sat down to do the Antoine Project, and I found it. Mm-hmm. And talk about adding, like you said, another dimension. Suddenly we have this biography. It was these pieces that came together that allowed the story to be told.
Yes. And it was just, I really appreciate also acknowledging that father-son dynamic. And when we connect, when we talk about the societal issues that especially Black people are going through, mm-hmm. and we talk about the importance of fathers and how fathers were separated in times of enslavement, and that's still something that is part of, that comes all the way down from that. And I love that you're touching on that, because you're showing the importance of a father and how he shaped his son's life, and how that being that tearing apart still impacts our community is something that we need to resolve. It goes much deeper than just saying, oh, just stop crying. It's something that that it's a societal thing that was placed upon
Oh,
Black people.
absolutely. And if you look at the slave inventories that were made upon successions when people died or in times of sale, they did not list the children with their father. Typically, the children were always listed with their mother. So it was the mother and the children. And they would list, now this is typical, I'm not saying this is like this with everything, but on Creole plantations, on what we deal with, it would be the males, the men listed first, then the women, and alongside the women, children up to the age of about 10 or 11. When you were around 10 or 11 years old, then you could be sold separately from your mother. The father was never grouped with the family, with units typically, because enslaved people were not allowed to marry and to enter into a contract under the law. So their marriages went unrecognized. And like what you're saying, what I see in so many documents, particularly these pension files of the Union soldiers, like Antoine's son, later on they say, oh, well, their marriage doesn't count because it was entered into during slavery.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so you're holding against them that they didn't marry under the law, but you were enslaving them at the time and not allowing them to marry. So families were really, really important to them. Kinship networks, where they created their own family, pieced together either because they had been lost family through being sold or through death, which mortality rates were so high. Like it was so important. And we see family as an important aspect of life in the river parishes today. And it was really what got them through the brutality of the enslaved experience. And that was one of the things I knew. If I wrote about Antoine, I had to write about the whole community, because you can't understand his life without knowing about the community in which he lived. And that community was so strongly based on family ties.
Well, I think that's so great that you point that out, because it's, I call it moving the goalpost, so that whenever you achieve some level, it's, oh no, but it's still not enough. And I have to, I mean, if anybody knows in my organization, one of the big things that we fight is environmental justice.
Oh, yes.
So I will put it out there, right? We fight environmental racism, and we're fighting a grain terminal that is going to try to enter into our community and destroy it, basically. And one of the things that we're fighting so hard is about the importance of community, and that my community has been living together as a village for, since
almost 300 years.
300 years. And so like, it's all of these different things. It's not just moving families, is that you will break up this really important community that's so important, that will get you through the hard times. Like we rely on that as our therapy, as improvement. That's part of our quality of life. So thank you for paying attention and going deep into the community that was around him.
Well, that touches on, so many people ask, both just in terms of the book and Antoine's life, and also in terms of in tourism. And like when I'm at Laura talking to tourists, why did they stay? Why did the enslaved people remain? Now, some of them left, some of them did go seek other opportunities, but the vast majority stayed. Why would they do that? And people would say, well, I would get out of there as soon as I could. As soon as the war ended, I'd be gone. What they don't understand is that the plantation, well, being owned by someone, okay? And we, in our mind, see it as Jacques Telesphore Roman's plantation. Oak Alley was the Roman plantation. Well, actually, it was their home too. It was the home of the enslaved people. And they had been there for generations. That community had been present and for 100 years at that point almost. So for them to leave their home, that would be such a terrible thing for them in a lot of ways, because that was their support system and their network. I mean, they had not been educated. Many of them didn't speak English. So do you risk leaving all of that? And the thing that mattered most to them was their home and their faith, church and their family, okay? So that's why they stayed. They stayed because they needed each other, and they weren't going to just abandon each other.
Right. It reminds me of evacuating for hurricanes too. Like you go through that same type of feeling of, do I stay? Do I go? And you're kind of you're weighing what the positives and the negatives of each. And one thing is also looking at the infrastructure of the state, right? And the system you're leaving, and what's better. So I think of that too, like them evacuating.
like they didn't. It costs money to move.
Right.
You need resources to move. You need to know you have a job guaranteed down the road. They didn't have any of that.
Right.
So the one thing that they knew for certain that they had was their family, and in family, all these, even if they weren't biologically family, and I'm sure you deal with this in your family all the time, where they may not be biologically related, but they're like family. They're friends that have been so close that they're like family, or have intermarried and are deeply connected. They were all interconnected.
Well, we acknowledge, I mean, you could be third, fourth, fifth cousin, and it's still cousins, and like it's still like your first cousin in my area. Right. So it's, as long as you have a little relation, that's all that it takes to be considered close family and close kin.
And that's what it was like when Antoine was alive, and his son Jeff, and it's not that far removed from it today. And right. I mean, you grew up just a few miles down the road from where Antoine lived, and the communities of Vacherie and Wallace is where Joe is from, are very close. And the people there, I mean, like, you know,
right, exactly.
It's
funny when I have a cafe as well, and I'll have people come to my cafe, and I'm like, "Oh, are you from here?" And they're like, "No, I'm not from here. I'm from Vacherie," which is like 2 miles. Oh, I'm from Edgar. It's like 3 miles. I'm from Lucy, and I was like, "Y'all, that's like right here." But it just shows you how those are different places, but they're so close together.
They're close, but then they have their own identity.
They have their own identity.
Right.
So yeah, I think that's just funny. One, I liked in your book how, although an enslaved person like Zephyr and Antoine would have had some, I don't know if you call it privilege, but as being the importance that they had on a plantation, according to their system, the importance that they had, you would think they had more liberty. But what also I found was very, intriguing was that person also had more responsibility, and that if the sugar was not cooked exactly the right way, then all of that that brunt of that would have gone to Zephyr or Antoine if something went wrong. And so can you just talk a little bit about how with much power comes much responsibility?
It's true. And I think that there is a mindset that enslaved domestics or enslaved people with prominent positions like the sugar maker, like the gardener, that they got off easy. When in fact, if you think about it, there were a lot of psychological ramifications that came with this. So they were in closer contact with the owners, the masters, and thus they had a greater opportunity to encounter conflict or controversy or be exposed to punishment. So yes, as a field hand, you lived in worse conditions. You labored longer and harder in many aspects, but you were on your own, kind of off in the quarters community, where it was a bit safer. It was a bit more insulated. Whereas if you were an enslaved domestic or someone like Antoine, Antoine was working right next to Jacques Telesphore-Roman, and he was telling him what he wanted his garden to look like. And he was trying to get his wife to want to be out in the country because she was a New Orleans girl and wanted to stay in the city. So he's trying to get her out there, and he had this vision. And there's a lot of pressure on Antoine to do this. There was a lot of pressure on him to propagate the pecan. So, on the one hand, here was Antoine with this opportunity to do something that he actually loved, that he was passionate about, which many enslaved people, they didn't get a choice in what they did. They labored day in and day out for someone else, doing something that they may never have had any interest in doing. But he did. And he was able to use his skills to, find rewarding fulfillment in his job. But at the same time, at the end of the day, whose garden was it?
That's right. It was not his.
No. And he might have in his heart have said and felt, this is my garden. And I'm sure he had to have put as much effort and energy into it as he did. But at the end of the day, it wasn't his. And that's the heartbreaking thing of it all.
And it's heartbreaking that his story is decided by the powers that be what weight his story should have. Is it the main story when you go to the big house and you're looking at the oak trees? Do we talk about Antoine at that point? No, it's tucked away in the back.
Mm-hmm.
It's acknowledged, okay? It's acknowledged, but it's an optional part. It's tucked away in the back. And do you even know that? And I just feel as a descendant, stories like that, plantations have a responsibility to tell these stories and especially connect the descendant communities around them to stories like this, to show them all the different aspects of a plantation. Sure, you want to show you beautiful columns and stuff, but what about stories like Antoine that, my God, he created all the pecans are coming from this person in Vacherie in St. James Parish. And we're talking about tobacco, we're talking about sugarcane, we're talking about Formosa. Where is Antoine's story in all of this? So that leads me to have you connected to the descendants of Antoine and been able to share the story with them or incorporate some of their stories into your research?
I actually have. It was just so remarkable because through my work at Laura Plantation, when I found Jeff Roman, his enlisted name as a soldier was Jeff Roman, but then he became Jeff Antoine, and he took his father's last name as his surname, not the name of the man who enslaved him. So that was huge. That was part of how I knew. But when I found that, Sand and I were working on trying to find photographs, or because they're just so few images, and connect with families. And one man, I found his profile on Ancestry.com. And we have a strict policy. We don't contact people out of the blue. We do it if they're interested, if they show that they want to learn about their ancestry. And so I did contact him. And he reached out to me, and his wife was actually a descendant of Antoine's. And so we shared information, and he alerted me to the fact of that they actually owned land in Jefferson Parish. His Antoine's daughter-in-law purchased land after the Civil War in Jefferson Parish, so that I wouldn't have known that. I wouldn't have thought to look in Jefferson Parish. So that was extremely helpful to me, and it once again helped add more to the narrative. But when the book came out, she said, she was so supportive, and I said, no, I'm sending you a copy. You don't worry about buying copies. So I signed it, and I sent one to her, and it was just the greatest feeling. Because she didn't know, they knew bits, but they didn't know the Antoine connection. And that just adds so much, really.
It's hard to believe when you say that this existed and this family really had bits and pieces, but didn't know everything, so much about it, that the importance of this creation. And it's great to have the information, but it's also painful to know that the records have kind of been in there collecting dust, and they haven't been explored. So, but thank goodness you bring them out to light, and you're connecting the descendants to these amazing stories.
Thank you, Joe. And I love that. I loved helping you with that. But it's a wonderful give and take. Like, I couldn't have fully done it if I hadn't known the information you gave me. So it's a working together. And that's what's really exciting about it too.
Yeah, it's a collaboration, because when you gave me information, I think I gave you a picture of my So we had a picture. I actually found another picture that I want to share with you, but that was it's a collaboration, and I'm happy you bring that point up too, because I think that this is very sensitive, precious information. And I know a lot of people are like, oh, you're being too sensitive, but it's sensitive subject when you're talking about anybody's history, but you're dealing with very sensitive information, and you're not the person maybe that they want to hear that information from. I'm just going to be honest. Okay, that you might not be the person, and they may say like, it may be, are you into this? Are you doing this for helping, or is this some type of white savior complex? I'll put it like that. But so I think it's great that you have the collaboration, and you're understanding that. So just if you can speak on that, having those.
Well, I think at the end of the day, for me, it's just a fascination with stories and people's lives. And I find, while I'm very introverted and would often prefer to stay at home with just my dead people and my books, I do still like people and find their stories fascinating and amazing. And that's what drew me in. And I mean, what's more compelling than these stories of these people who went through so much adversity and overcame it and have triumphed, and focusing not just on the ways, not just on the tragedy. Obviously, we must talk about the tragedy of it all, but also the triumphs and the wonderful things that happened, how they fell in love and cared about their families and did amazing things like Antoine. So I see that as my goal is to tell stories that help build empathy. And what I've found myself best at in terms of research is researching the enslaved. And I guess I just find them fascinating, and also think, because my family's been here like yours since the very start. And what I knew all along is that we are all interconnected. I always knew it. I maybe couldn't put words into it, but like when I was at LSU in the dorm room with me, we had an apartment. It was 2 on each side. There was a Guillory who was of African American girl named Guillory. Well, my great grandmother was a Guillory, so I immediately knew. And sure enough, I dug further and saw that yes, we were connected. My friend Jeremy Simeon, I worked with him on the Belisaire project. And he and I are related in multiple ways through multiple families. So it's not just, slavery isn't just Black people history. It's also white people history. It's in fact American history. So I felt that it was part of my history and part of what needed to be told. And it really didn't seem like there were many people telling this. And I stepped up to the plate a little bit. I hope I've done my share.
Oh yeah, and I think thank you for saying that. It's such an excellent point, because it is a sensitive subject, but I love that it is everybody's history, and it's part of, just like we have to learn about George Washington. I don't say that George Washington is not part of my history, or Thomas Jefferson or whatever. There's not such a divide. So the same should be for Black history, especially if you think about Antoine and his pecans. And everybody uses pecans, right?
Yes.
So I think it's good to acknowledge as part of everybody's history. It's not just 1 month a year that we should be honoring the impact of Black people to history. Any other, people of color, BIPOC communities, it should be year round integrated into our, and it doesn't take a theory. That's not like a master's graduate level critical race theory in order to do that, so that's just to bring that up. But that's just part of history, right? Just simple history.
You're just telling history.
You're just telling history.
And you're doing it because so much of the story wasn't being told.
Right.
It was either not being told or romanticized in a way that was inaccurate. We can't have that. But like with Antoine's story, there's so much there. I think why people have connected with it is because there's the gardening aspect of it. There's the pecan aspect of it for people who love to cook and enjoy pecans. There's the Civil War aspect of it. So, it's definitely really important that it's a story of an enslaved man, but there are other aspects, and it just goes to show you that, they're multifaceted. Antoine was not just one stock character. He had many different interests and draws people's interest, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And you're talking about the war and the Union. It's just something that I honestly, growing up, I have hardly any stories, as much stories as my grandmother and my grandfather told us. They told us about the FIFO and the Loup-Garou and all of these things. The Civil War and the Union soldiers were never part of their stories. So it blows me away when you're talking about the presence of the Union and then Antoine and Zephyr's connection to that. So can you explain a little bit more about the Civil War history that we have, particularly the Union that we have along the river parishes?
Sure. That's kind of one of my passions, really. That's what I feel so compelled to share with people. And San Marmion and I are working on a project, a book right now about it, and have been working for years. It's part of the exhibit featured at Laura. The Union Army and Louisiana's contribution to the Union Army was so important, and it's overlooked. So we hear about glory up in Massachusetts, and we think that they were the first African-American soldiers to participate in battle and join up. The first Black soldiers in this country were right here in New Orleans, and they joined up first. They were the Louisiana Native Guards, and they were the ones who, after the occupation of New Orleans, became, under General Butler, military units, the Louisiana Native Guards. These were predominantly free men of color from the city of New Orleans. And then they went upriver to protect the railroad, which went along where the plantations were, along the river in St. John and St. James and St. Charles parishes. And in doing so, they were the ones who liberated the enslaved people on the plantations.
Mm-hmm.
So what you had were these people in slavery looking up, seeing people who looked like them, coming through saying, okay, you don't have to do this anymore, or you do have to do it, but let's work out our labor contracts, and the Freedmen's Bureau comes in and let's get you money for it. And we're not going to have this, you're not going to be bought and sold anymore. So that was huge. And one of the things that just breaks my heart is that people nationally, and people here, and people whose families were involved in it, have no idea Louisiana's contribution to the Union Army. They have no idea that they sent the most Black soldiers to fight. I mean, they have no idea that they were the first. And this is a huge story, and something that really needs to be told, because Louisiana was like the proving ground, the testing ground for what would then happen throughout the South in terms of liberation of slaves, labor conditions on plantations, and Reconstruction. So what you had were multiple generations. Like Antoine at that point was elderly and an old man, and he was back on the plantation, but his son and so many others ran away, enlisted in the Union Army to fight for freedom. And when they did that, they were able to have their wives and their children immediately freed. So it's a story we don't hear about. And I know I'm digging. I'm going to do some digging, but I know you have some in your family and your community where you live in Wallace. I can't wait to work on this. Soldiers there as well.
Yeah, so. We are, because an experience, there's a movie filming in our area, and they is about exactly the same thing, about the Black soldiers who were in Louisiana and who were freeing enslaved. So I signed up to be an extra, just because I figured if I'm the Descendants Project, maybe it would be a good way to kind of experience this role and kind of get into their shoes, literally, and just feel it, just experience that. And it was done at a enslaved quarters, and so we really got to experience it. But the scene that we shot, it was us being freed. So the soldiers were coming and they were freeing us. And that was the first time I was like, I've never thought of a plantation as freedom too, as a start of freedom. Like I never thought in being freed by Black men. Yeah. And that's something that you don't see in Hollywood. You don't see the Black man coming in as the hero and rescuing the Black community. So that dynamic was the first time it just like hit me, and the importance of the Union soldiers and their story and how much I had not thought about it. So I definitely knew, like, for my organization, that's something we want to stress. And thankfully have you and Sand and helping us to bring that information to light as well. Yeah.
I'm excited.
And also finding some connections to, my ancestors or relatives. I'm not really sure who were part of that regiment as well. So,
well, that's what they don't realize is so many men up and down the River Road, enslaved men, joined up. And there are no monuments, there are no markers, there's nothing honoring them. You drive down the River Road, you've got a marker for a Confederate soldier up still. And ironically, it's not where his plantation was located, it's where his grandfather's was. And he was actually the father of an enslaved child, but you don't hear about that either. So, we have a lot of work to do in terms of the landscape of slavery and figuring out a way to honor these men.
Yeah, and it's like, once again, moving the goalpost. Whenever you get somewhere, it changes, or there's a new rule or road you have to cross in order to get there. So one thing that I know, we were talking about freedom and that Zephyr was actually freed, but was he really freed? So can you talk about that a little bit more in that complicated situation?
Sure. So one of the profoundly tragic ironies is that you would find that enslaved people, once they became elderly and were suddenly a burden and couldn't contribute anymore, their masters suddenly became, benevolent and decided to free them. And then it was, well, they had nowhere to go and no place to live and no way to support themselves. So this was, we don't know exactly the specifics of what happened to Zephyr, but when he was about 60 or 70 years old, he was freed, theoretically because of his service to the Roman family as the sugar maker. He was allowed to continue to live on the plantation, but it was a pseudo freedom. So he was still living on the plantation, probably in the same house, in the same conditions, and he's free on paper, but that's about all he is. He earned enough money to buy his wife. So he and his wife were living there ostensibly free, in that they could not be sold away, but they could be kicked off at any time, and they had to watch as their children could be bought or sold or separated. So it this idea of freedom was never fully realized until after the Civil War, and it wasn't even realized then, was it? Because we're still working for it now.
Yeah. We're still working through the systems. Is one of the things that the plantation system is still. It's still so operational in the river parishes. When you look at the government, when you look at agencies, you look at boards, and you see that it's you have to go through all these different steps in order to become a part of something, which is another roadblock that you never have, that you never achieve what's needed to get in that position. So you're right, it still exists.
Well, and it's unfortunate that so many of these areas where the plantations were, the people who are descendants still live all around there. Many in great poverty are in challenging circumstances. Not all, but quite a few. And with limited resources are jobs out there. And then now we've got this new plantation kind of thing coming in, because you've got the chemical plants coming in, and they're taking over vast areas. They're transforming the landscape. So, on the one hand, you've got them destroying the historic landscape with the plantations, but they're also threatening the communities that have survived. And many of Antoine's ancestors, quite a few of his, descendants, still live in that area.
And these are, as much as we can use Antoine as a way to see descendants that are still there and still suffering. It's good that we acknowledge him, but then the true way to acknowledge him is to respect his descendants and protect them, and that's something with tourism. Going back to that, it's like, the true people who own it are not the ones who own the homes, because anybody can buy a house. The bloodline, to me, is the most important. That's where the history truly exists, and what's being done to protect those people. What agencies what's being done to help them, not just the structure, although I definitely like preservation.
Yeah. Preservation.
I own my own plantation, and that God knows, Lord, I got a big project to restore that. But at the same time, like it's utilizing that to help the community.
Right. And that's, it's complex, but then it isn't complex. You would think it would seem more straightforward in that, you can look at Antoine's story and say these children in the river parishes, they don't hear about people like Antoine. And when they study American history, they hear one kind of set narrative, and they need to hear the stories of the great people who became before them, who endured all of this and still managed to be brilliant and amazing. And Antoine's story is an inspiration to them, not only about pride in their heritage, but in who they can be and what they can achieve in their own lives, if that makes sense.
No, and do you see them? And it's easy to see Antoine's name, easier, I should say, on a wall, etched in wood or what have you. But when you walk off that site, do you see Antoine and the people around it? Do you see the Antoine family, which I know of Antoine's and never realized that connection. So that's just what, like, I like that you have this story, you reached out to the descendants, you put a name to it, you made that connection so that we understand this is a real family and a real person.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the hardest, most tragic things about slavery is that, people can study them and not really see enslaved people as human beings like them. It's the tragedy is just when you stop and start thinking about the system and chattel slavery, it's just so huge and so depressing and so just overwhelming that people set it aside and they want it at a distance.
Right,
They don't want
right,
to be close to
right.
it because then they have to really feel something and really care and then question their own decisions in their life and what they could do to be more empathetic or help and that's what I wanted to do with Antoine, was make him a real person, because he was.
Right. A really real person, a complex person.
Right.
And you have to just go with the complexity and stop trying to, you don't need to stop it. You can just really lean into it and figure out just the different struggles and the successes that he had in his life, for his family. Yeah.
So we actually have a question from online, if you guys are ready for Q&A.
Absolutely.
Sure.
Okay. So, Joe, can you tell us about the stories you heard from your grandparents about their connection to the river parishes?
Well, my grandparents, I was very fortunate. My grandparents were my babysitters. So as my parents worked, we got to spend time with my grandparents. And my grandmother especially was just an excellent communicator. I think that's why my sister and I both went into the communications field, because we were raised with all of these amazing stories. And my grandparents, particularly my grandmother, she saw everything as just unique and special and connected to everything. So she could just describe it in a way that really made us appreciate it. There was no such thing as simplicity, even if it was simple, because she knew how to describe it in a way that made it magical. And that made, as my sister and I realized the connection that we had to the land and to the river parishes, and understand that we were rooted here, but in a good way. It's not that we're trying to leave it or that we couldn't leave. Is that where else can we go when we can, be on the same land that my grandmother talked about, farming the garden with her dad, or speaking, my grandmother speaking French and then speaking Creole with two of her grandparents who were married. And one was German, one was half enslaved and half African and half indigenous. And so, just hearing all of those different ways that she connected to it really made us connect to the history. And we wanted to show that story. When we talk about tourism, we wanted to make sure that story was being told and that people understand there's a deeper connection. There's so many different connections, like Antoine, like folk tales that are in the river parishes and should be protected.
Okay, Brittany has one more question, the same person, and I'm not sure that I quite understand it. I'm going to read it the way she typed it. So we'll see. Can Joe tell us about the Fifoulet Cafe and the trail that's outside the cafe?
Yeah, so I think I get the question. We made a cafe. We named it the Fifoulet because that was my grandmother's absolute favorite folktale, which is, depending on what culture you come from, and for Cajuns is more of a light and a swamp. For Creoles is more of a witch. And that's also in Trinidad. We have some customers from Trinidad who came to visit the cafe, and they talked about the Fifoulet was more of a witch, which is coincidentally how my grandmother described it. So in honor of my grandmother, we named the cafe the Fifoulet Cafe, and we made a trail that listed all of her different folk tales that she told us, because we wanted to add our input into tourism and be a nice little space that's giving a different side of the history.
All right, well, I wanted to go to the cafe before, but now I have to go to the cafe.
Yes.
And you want to talk about another not as known, not as prevalent part of the history of the river parishes. It's the folk tales.
Right.
And Laura Plantation has done a great job of spotlighting the Brer Rabbit stories and their origin in the Vacherie area that Alcée Forche wrote down. But you lived that. I mean, that was part of your childhood. Those were the stories you grew up with. And so you are helping to preserve that and to inform people about it. And I think it's Laura and y'all that are really doing that.
Well, the story of Brer Rabbit or Compalapan, that is that's told even at Laura Plantation. My grandmother, my grandparents would tell that story often. And that story I realized was about resistance and about breaking the system. And one of the stories has the bunny, or the wise rabbit, basically escaping, tricking the farmer into throwing him into the briar patch where he was actually born, and he escaped really through a thorny situation because he was born in a thorny situation. I'm paraphrasing for time. But when I think about fighting environmental justice and fighting the grain terminal and why we're fighting, and when we go against them, like I was born in this thorny situation. So this is where you like, I'm here, I'm comfortable here, I can fight you here. And I think about that rabbit and how he fought the system and has to keep breaking it. So yeah, that story, I'm so happy that, you know, Laura Plantation as well does a good job and has a great illustrated book about it as well too.
Right.
I got another question if we don't have another from in-house. Can you tell us if there are any artifacts or connections your family has to the Whitney Plantation?
We have my grandmother's cane knife is at Whitney Plantation. So that is, and that cane knife was handed down from her father for sure. I think it was handed down from his father. So I think it was like the 1800s.
Wow.
I didn't realize it. And so that was my grandmother's her cane knife, and that's what she killed snakes with. I remember when she'd see a snake, she'd go run and get her cane knife and she would just start chopping it. So that was her snake killer. That's how I saw her use it, really, is to kill snakes.
Do we have any other questions?
One comment and one question. The question is, what inspired you to do a book on pecan trees? And the comment is, as I sit here and listen, the pecan tree was very, very important in the community because I'm from that Bastrop. And I do have a grand tree soft shell. But a pecan was really hooked up with the gardening aspect of seasonal growth. Because when the pecan bear or blooms, not bear, but blooms, like a doubloon, like extra doubloon, the bloom, when it blooms, you can ensure that no cold weather is going to kill the plant, the young vegetation. And it will always bloom on Good Friday.
Yeah, it is. The pecan is just this kind of quintessentially Southern and South Louisiana kind of plant. And it, of course, grows wild. And you're right, it has kind of a deeper meaning and an important meaning to the communities, I think. And Sand and we met with a descendant from Laura Plantation, and she said, you know, it's funny you bring that up because I think pecans lend themselves to metaphor in a way to people. She said, I just felt like I was this little pecan, just fell off the tree, dropped on the ground. I didn't know where it came from. And now y'all have told me and helped me realize where I am and where I'm from. And I've lived here all my life, just a few miles down the road. I had no idea the connection. So, I mean, it was funny she chose that image. But even in Antoine, I end it with a woman named Helene, who was the nurse to Alce Forche. She was enslaved in Valker M's home, which was the original Roman plantation, which is where Antoine was born. And they were interconnected. They were related, family members. So she was very elderly. And Alce Forche came out to visit her in New Orleans. And she lists what they brought, and he bought her pecans. So pecans were they were a treat, but they were also, I think, a means of foraging and survival for going back to the Native Americans even. I mean, this is just a tree that has so much history. And I mean, I fell in love with Antoine. With him, and I saw it as a story about Antoine, but the pecan obviously is just crucial to the whole thing. Yeah.
Being that as a calendar, and the second comment is other trees that I could see Antoine having real good knowledge of is the elm tree, which is a personification of our cypress tree, which is the cedar tree. Like Nightmare on Elm Street. And also the copal. I don't know if you're familiar with that word, the copal, which is the oak tree. And the grove in front of Oak Alley. So, you know, the trees being that idle for whatever strange reason, it destroyed, I would say, 80% of the pecan tree.
What happened with the pecans and it's unfortunate. I'm glad you bring that up. We would love to visit Oak Alley and see Antoine's legacy very visible in terms of pecans there. I, in fact, was at Barnes & Noble doing a signing, and someone came up to me and said, but there are no pecan trees at Oak Alley. Like.
Has pasture.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just strange. I was not cutting down because it's already destroyed. But the guys that they from pasture, in has pasture. I'm playing in has pasture.
Magnolia.
So stay wrong track. Okay, that's what we call has.
Mm-hmm.
Has. And anyway, they had some very old pecan trees. And they went in there and said, they would cut them up and dump them.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, no way. Because the trees are at least 100 years, I guess. And they're so beautiful. So I was able to get some nice size, log. The guys just did not have no knowledge, of the pecan tree. And I mean, it really did a number in has pasture.
And
got
that
down some pretty big trees, and I was like, so I was made, able to get branches. I told them, so well, I like to smoke, barbecue, and like that, at least,
Yeah, that land you're talking about, that was originally owned by Sostan Roman.
Right.
So this is it's a Roman Empire, okay? The Roman Empire. So and because he bought it much later, but Sostan Roman owned that, and then Telesphore Roman owned Oak Alley, and then Valcarem, who was married to Josephine Roman, owned the Valcarem plantation right there. So there's this dynastic kind of thing, and they would share. Part of what I talk about is they were very into their gardens. It was a means of showing wealth, but also passion, and so they would share cuttings, and they would talk about techniques and things. But unfortunately, there are no pecans left at Oak Alley because after the war, they wanted to use all the land for sugarcane. They cut so many of the pecans right when they were coming into the best harvest they would have had, like at their peak. And there were only 2 remaining when the Department of Agriculture sent a representative out in the early 1900s. Yeah.
It probably was the time when my great grandfather Luis, he had about 500 head of brambles at Oak Alley.
Oh.
On the backside
of
the track. And he had a lot of pecans in the pasture.
There you go.
So around 1940, when the so-called Bang disease developed, between World War I and World War II, they lost a lot of their cows, 500 head.
Wow.
Black brambles. Not black, but black. And I'm saying that because the land was grazed, and you had God knows how much corn seeds. And I promised them more.
But this is your history and the place you're from.
I know my history.
I know, and I'm glad. No, I'm saying I'm glad you're sharing it.
I'm not going to never allow anyone, because I'm fortunate to see all my grandparents. One of my great, and I was all fortunate to see males on both sides, all the way. And Pop my noon, but I know about the pecan tree. That's what he shared with me. We was not going to plant until that pecan tree had buds. Until it bloomed.
Thank you for sharing that. And
I mean, it's sorry that we don't have any more indigenous farmers like myself, but it is what it is. So I got 2 kids. They wanted to be PhDs, one in physics, one in IB, but grant their title, one in athletic psychology. But look how much PhD you got. You got to understand how that sun work with the earth. Feed yourself.
There is a whole movement of indigenous or black farmers and huge movements that are.
I mean, it's really big. It's connecting because there has been this connecting to like plantations that Black people got away from farming and gardening.
Exactly. There was a negative
stigma, right? And
yes.
so Black and a big Black movement, and the movement from everybody. So I'm not saying just, but
yeah, there is a resurgence overall, but there is this niche of Black people saying we're going to embrace this
exactly, and understanding the connection of land, and there's such joy, and that's something that what we find, especially in the organization and working with environmental justice, is that our families, the Black families, were the ones working the land. They were the ones touching the land. They had the connection. The owning families were just basically tilling it, moving it on. They did not have that connection. So it's trying to reestablish that and showing that it's not a stigma. And it's an important part of our identity is being connected to the earth. So there's a lot of attention. I wish I could farm. I tried, but you probably want my cucumbers. But
I was contacted by an organization. The woman had purchased Antoine and was reading it, was sharing it with her organization, and they encourage Black farming and African Americans to start their own orchards and enable them through giving them seeds and cuttings. And she found Antoine's story so inspirational to that organization. So yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up. That's a good point.
Small world. I never thought I was coming to talk about pecan.
Well, like when you bring that up, it makes me think about Antoine and Belcourt, which we call the Big Garden. That was the way we called it in my great grandparents. When the plantation burned down, they went on there and actually bought. They borrowed some of the plants that were on there. So they moved it to our neighborhood, but I don't know that we have any more of those. But I grew up with those plants in my life, the big elephant ears, the pond lilies, all these different cuttings that we had no idea. And I'm thinking Antoine was
probably he was involved in that.
He was involved with
absolutely, because that was where he got his start. That's where he learned how to garden. And then when the Romans divided their property, he then went to Oak Alley. So yeah, he was instrumental in those very famous. It's a very famous garden. I mean, it's kind of mythological in history now, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
Oh wow, Joe, I didn't know that. You gotta tell me more things.
The Big Garden was such an interesting. That was it was just so many interesting stories about that place. So yeah, we definitely have to talk about it, right? Yeah.
I've got one more question here, and then maybe we'll do one more question in-house if we have it. Joe, can you tell us about your plantation house?
So I did not know it was a plantation home, but it was a home that I loved ever since I was a child, and living along the river and driving. I went to school in Ascension Parish, so I had to drive from St. John to St. Ascension along the river road, and I saw all the different big plantation homes. But there was one particular house that I fell in love with, and I always just wanted. I had no idea that it was a plantation. Anyway, the house was years later. The home was being sold, but you had to move it off the property. So it's this massive house, this big Creole cottage, and it has a really tall roof. So I begged my parents, I'm like, can we please get this house? It only cost $7,000 for the home, but it cost a lot of money to move it. That should have been our first clue. That is right. They're really selling this for cheap, but thankfully the family wanted the house to be preserved. So we did move it. We had land, and so we moved the house to our property. When we bought the house, the family who owned it gave us a history behind it and just a big binder full of information. That's we're going through the information. We realized that, this is the Scheck-Snyder family. It's like, we're Scheck-Snyders. And then we had to connect the dot and figured out that we descend from the inhabitants of that plantation home. So we had it. The house always called to me. I always felt and wanted to be back to us. So that would be the headquarters of our nonprofit. So we will hopefully start renovating that within the next couple of months. So yeah, we want to definitely get it in better condition before storm season comes. So that's our big project. But we're honored to be in possession of a plantation home that we're using to give back to the enslaved, the descendants of the enslaved, and bettering the community. So it's a strange story, but it's ours now.
This is the thing. It sounds strange to contemporary people outside of the community, but in that time and that age, the Scheck-Snyders were of all colors and all shades. They were interconnected. Many even acknowledged that they were interconnected. It was only with time that's changed and shifted. But that's actually a very normal story for St. John or St. James.
Yeah, and
Parish.
our land, well, the land that we own now, I mean, it's a decent piece of land, but there's like 500 heirs, so we may get 50 cents a year from our land.
Yeah.
But it's the original location of the house lines up where the land is. It's still the landing for the home is still in the river, so you can look up the coordinates of it, so we can even track it back to how our land, the original location of the home, and making that. That's important. That's why it's so important to have people like you who can help us with our history.
Well, and you for fighting for it.
Yeah,
I can't lose that.
Right.
That is something that cannot be lost. And I think, so many people are so interested in African American history and in telling story, going deeper. But unless we work to help people in the communities who are living this history still, right? Because you're still living that lineage, that your heritage.
Right, and we're preserving history too on all sides of it.
So unless we do that, then we're going to lose something tremendous, I think.
Absolutely. And hopefully one day we will have the Wallace exhibit
absolutely
at that plantation home. So I already have your space saved out. So
oh, fantastic. Sam and I just got to, finish writing a book and then we're all
right.
Do you have any more questions for anybody? All right. Thank you so much, Katy and Joe, for talking to us and sharing your book, Katy. We have Antoine of Oak Alley for sale downstairs. If you have a copy or you'd like to purchase a copy, grab it and bring it up, and Katy will sign it for you.
And it's just so wonderful to look out and see so many faces, old friends, and new friends, and forever friends, and just thanks for the support. Family.
Yeah.
Those people.